Well, a national bank can do a lot of things. I mean, depending on the country, depending on the time, depending on the circumstances. It provides a stable currency for a country. It regulates the banking system and the financial system of a country. It facilitates the movement of economic resources in a country from one jurisdiction to another. It provides an anchor for confidence in general in the economy and financial sector of a nation or another jurisdiction. Various countries, including the United States, have gone through periods where private banks have essentially filled that function. For a large part of U.S. history, private banks did fill that function. Canada didn't have a central bank until 1935, so for much of its existence as a country. But in general, and particularly for younger countries, but in general for any jurisdiction, the scale, the perceived independence and impartiality of a central bank as opposed to a private bank, the separation from commerce, which has become a feature of modern central banking, are all viewed as important in creating the trust in some of these centralizing features of a central bank that's important to achieving its objectives. For a central bank to do its job, it has to have a certain scale relative to the country. It has to have a certain central position in the financial system, and that can be viewed as a concentration of power that is dangerous. It can be that can create concerns simply because of the size of the institution. At the time that the first Bank of the United States was proposed, the financial system of the U.S. was absolutely an embryo. There were 3 banks in the entire country. There was soon to be a fourth. They had neither the scale nor the trust to really provide the type of financial support for what he hoped would be a rapidly growing economy. And he believed, I think history has borne him out on this, that an institution with the imprimatur of the government and the scale of the entire country was necessary to provide the financial support to the economy that was needed for that economy to really take off.
Why did Jefferson and Madison object to having a first bank?
Well, as you know, there were a number of reasons, some of them economic, some of them political, some of them legal. The concern about the concentration of power, concentration of economic power in the first instance was common. I think that certainly was a concern of Jefferson's. The potential concern for the concentration of political power that came from that concentration of economic power was a particular concern of Jefferson's. And then both Jefferson and Madison had concerns over the constitutionality of that. Did the Constitution actually permit the federal government, which was to be a government of limited powers and express powers, to set up a bank? It doesn't say that it can set up a bank, and so was that possible? I think that constellation of concerns underlay their objections. All of those concerns continued throughout the life of the first bank. I think the first bank was operated as a central bank. It achieved its objectives really quite well. But one of the ways that it achieved those objectives was by moderating the potential excesses of what was a growing state banking system. So at the time that the first bank was put into place, there were 4 banks in the country. Over the course of its 20-year life, the state banking system grew dramatically. And the state banks viewed the U.S. Bank, the Bank of the United States, as competition for them. it also viewed it as limiting their ability to expand because of its size, the Bank of the United States had the ability to go to a state bank with the notes of that state bank and demand payment in gold out of the treasury of that state bank. And that limited the ability of the state bank to expand its business because it knew that it always had to keep enough gold relative to its outstanding obligations to be able to satisfy the demands that were most likely to come from the Bank of the United States. So it kept a governor, if you will, on the stability of the financial system that was quite useful, but irksome if you were an ambitious state bank. And there were many more of them by the time that we came to the end of the first Bank of the United States in 1811. They didn't like that competition. And then you had, continuing through that time, the political and economic concerns about concentration of power and the continuing questions about constitutional legitimacy that ultimately led to the demise of the first bank. It was a close question, as you know. The charter was not renewed by one vote in each house because over the course of its 20-year life, it had demonstrated that it was a very useful institution. And indeed, Madison, who had been one of its principal opponents, by the time of the end of the life of the first state bank, was arguing that it is a near necessity. Now we must have this. It has demonstrated that it's constitutional, and it has certainly demonstrated that it's needed. No sooner had the first bank ended than we had the War of 1812, and the financial and economic upheavals of that war reinforced in the minds really of everyone the usefulness of a central bank. It would have been extremely useful in the financing of that war to have a central bank, and there were efforts during the war to try to reestablish a central bank in order to facilitate the financing of the war. For a variety of reasons during the war, those efforts weren't successful, but they were tactical rather than strategic. Almost immediately during the war, there became a general sentiment that we really need to have a central bank again. We need a Bank of the United States. The second bank got off to a pretty bad start. The people who were put in charge of it were not particularly good bankers. It itself contributed to an overexpansion. It competed aggressively against state and private banks as opposed to in a more measured way. And then in 1819, relatively shortly after its creation, it believed that it had facilitated an overexpansion and began calling in the notes of the state banks who called in their loans and contributed to the Panic of 1819. So it was mismanaged from the beginning, and that lent energy to these continuing legal and constitutional concerns about the appropriateness of the institution. The most aggressive of the offices of the second bank was the Baltimore office, where McCulloch was the cashier. And that was where some of the most aggressive practices were happening, including some that were probably outright fraudulent. And all of this, again, lent support to the and energy behind the legal challenges to the bank. Notwithstanding Marshall's ruling in favor of the bank, it ultimately its charter was not renewed by Andrew Jackson, and so we did have, starting in 1836, a period of 75 years where we did not have another central bank, and almost 30 years where we didn't have a national system of regulating currency or the financial sector at all. And so at one level, we have an answer as to how that might have happened. It was very important the decision was very important for the legal system and for our understanding of the Constitution and constitutional development. But for the Second Bank of the United States itself, it gave it a somewhat extended lease of life, but then it didn't continue to exist. And the extreme financial volatility of the late 19th century, I think, is a consequence of our not having a system of central banking. Andrew Jackson was was vehemently convinced, because of experiences in his own life, that banks in general were frauds upon the populace, that they contributed to booms and busts, that they issued paper currency that ultimately they weren't able to support, and a central bank was a bank times 10. All of those problems were exacerbated in a central bank. So he had, throughout his life, a vehement dislike of banks and banking, and central banks in particular, and he brought that to the presidency. After those early years of bad management, the second bank was put under the management of a very able man named Nicholas Biddle, and was almost a model of what a central bank should be, and performed a very useful service during a period of explosive growth in the U.S. economy. I mean, the population doubled, the economy tripled, and on the frontier, many multiples of expansion, and the ability of the Second Bank of the United States to facilitate the transfer of resources from concentrated parts in the East out to the expansion in the West and in the South was extremely important in what was a critical period in the establishment of the U.S. economy. And I don't think it could have happened without something like the Bank of the United States. So the Federal Reserve was established for very similar reasons as the first and second banks of the United States. It was to create a currency in which there could be national confidence that would not be extremely volatile. It was to create a system that would moderate booms and busts in the financial system in order to help create stability in that system's support for the real economy. It was created to facilitate the transfer of payments from one part of the country to another at a time when the existing private banking system was able to do that only very rudimentarily. And it still fills many of those functions today. Our mechanisms are different, but the fundamental purpose of having a solid currency in which there's universal trust, of facilitating the transfer of payments within our financial system, and of overseeing the financial sector and keeping it stable, as well as the overall economy and monetary policy for the support of the overall economy, are functions that we still fulfill. Many of the criticisms are this. They would have. You would find them. You wouldn't find them out of place in the 19th century or the 18th century. There are concerns about the concentration of power that comes from the sheer size of the Federal Reserve. There are concerns about accountability in a democracy. I think our system addresses those very well, but the critics have many of the same concerns that have existed about central banking throughout our history and, frankly, throughout the history of central banking. I think Marshall saw the importance of a strong central bank in creating a strong economy, and the importance of a strong national economy to the creation of a robust nation. And the Fed still fills that role. And so I'm pretty confident that while how we do our job is different than how the first and second banks of the United States did their job, the job we're doing is still essentially that, and that he would find it both as necessary and as constitutional as he did in McCulloch against Maryland. Both the first and second banks, out of necessity, were commercial banks that dealt with the public. In some ways, they They competed with private banks and with state banks. And we don't have that direct competition anymore in most areas of banking business. In some technical ways, what we do is different. You can no longer come to the central bank and get a certain amount of gold or silver for the obligations of the central bank. But in other ways, what we do is exactly the same. The dollar bill that you have in your pocket is an obligation of the Federal Reserve System, and it is backed by assets that have a value behind all of the currency that's out in circulation to assure everyone who holds that currency that is rock solid and stable and will always be worth what it says that it's worth. So our function in creating that stability and confidence is still exactly the same.
Why do people dislike central banks?
Well, from the very beginning of central banking, there have been concerns about the concentration of economic power, the concentration of financial power, the potential concentration of political power that comes from having a single financial institution at the center of the system. Over time, as the theory of central banking has evolved, governance mechanisms have been developed that I think address all of those concerns, but they remain even today. There are those who are concerned that the existence of a central bank creates the potential for problems that would not be there if it didn't exist.
Why was the Second Bank of the United States unpopular at the beginning of its life?
So the second bank got off to a bad start. The management that was put in charge of it, both at the top and then particularly in some of the branches, was very aggressive, very expansive. In some cases, they engaged in practices that I think were pretty clearly fraudulent. That particularly happened in Baltimore. And all of that lent energy to criticisms of the bank that arose from some of these perennial concerns over concentration of power and in the United States over the basic constitutionality of the institution that might not have been there if it had started on a more sober note.
And McCulloch v. Maryland is heard right in the middle of all of this.
Right, at the beginning of that process, and the branch in question in McCulloch against Maryland was the Baltimore branch, which was the most aggressive and most controversial of the branches in those early years.
What would John Marshall think of the Fed if he came back and saw it, vis-a-vis the first and second banks, which he knew?
So the way that we fill the job of a central bank today is different in a number of details from the way the first and second banks of the United States operated, but the fundamental function of the central bank that we fill, I think, is the same. And I think we see from McCulloch against Maryland that Marshall saw that a strong financial system was important to a dynamic economy, which was important to a successful nation. And we fill that same role in anchoring trust in the financial system and in the U.S. economy today that the first and second banks were designed to do. And I'm pretty confident that even in the face of the different mechanisms for accomplishing it, he would say that task is both as necessary and as constitutional today as it was then.
Why did Andrew Jackson determine to destroy the second bank?
Jackson, throughout his life, had a hatred of banks, not just of central banks, but of banking. He viewed the paper money that they issued as a fraud upon the populace. And in the frontier areas where he grew up, that was not an illogical conclusion. The value of the state banknotes that they issued frequently depreciated substantially. That worked great hardship on the on the populace of those frontier areas, and he brought that hatred of banks to his view of the Bank of the United States, and multiplied that with the concerns about concentration of power and the potential for insider abuse that existed with a bank of that size. It was really, I think, never going to be possible for the proponents of the second bank, however good their evidence that it was in fact addressing some of the concerns that he had about banking, to persuade Andrew Jackson that this was anything but an abomination.